day. Welcome back for another day. So this morning's a little bit different because the plan for this morning is to continue our discussion from Tuesday. Want that to be a little bit more conversational, and then we're gonna have a panel discussion on the same. So this morning's really interactive. I hope everybody got their coffee and is ready with all their questions. And that's where I wanted to start actually, just to make sure, because if we spend the entire time on this, I'm okay with it, because I wanna make sure that we're addressing what you all are thinking about. So what's on people's minds? I know at various points, it seems like we've had a lot of different questions and you've had a couple days to absorb what we were talking about on Tuesday. So who wants to kick off?
So Sarah, if I can ask a favor. So from yesterday talk, so I realized there are two pathways in which a scientist with an intellectual property can approach the problem. One is to do a study, in which you as a scientist became more or less the leader of what you are doing. You are assembling the team, then come a venture capital, take the power from you, and this is the game. The second is what Hope Larry showed.
Larry Hope,
you are relying on a very powerful institution to do the deals with you. The situation in which you are not anymore in the driving chair, but as a good employee and as an institution don't want to fight with an employee who come with bright ideas, you get a part of the game and so on. How can we choose between these two things? How can we, as people unprepared in this field of venture capital, without friends, without colleagues that can push the buttons, can really choose, look, this is the way to go, or this is the way to go. Because are completely not interchangeable. So if you start in a way, you cannot then shift it.
It's a good question, right? So it's a really good question. Why would you do a startup if you could just let an institution develop it and make you a bunch of money? And the answer is, if your institution is going to develop it and put in most of the risk, right, you should want to let them do that, right? Why would you fight it? For example, so MD Anderson has done this a fair amount. UT Southwestern has done this a bit. Some of the other institutions have done this. Baylor has some of their own sort of clinical trial capability as well. Not all the institutions have that, frankly. So one of the answers might be it's not an option for you, right? But even at those locations, like we have people here from MD Anderson, we have people here from UT Southwestern. Sometimes it's not an option as well because, the thing with these early stage technologies is, I think I made this comment before, is it's really difficult. Even really smart people who are really sophisticated and keep an eye on the market, you can only do so many things a year, so you have to cut some projects. And if you're at a very large institution, not all the projects can be advanced internally all the time. Nobody has unlimited dollars, right, to do these projects. Not even Pfizer or Merck or Amgen. So things will get left on the cutting room floor, right? And, you might have a perspective that, signals that make you think that it's still worth developing, but it just, for whatever reason, doesn't fit the internal processes. It might be a mission, it might be like sort of an alignment, maybe they decided to focus on specific areas. Might just be whoever did the screening that day, or was looking over the project and didn't have the full understanding of what they were looking at sometimes, right? And that's where you can get a little bit better at presenting your projects. And we had a couple projects last year where the inventor realized that maybe licensing things out was the right path, right? Maybe they didn't want to do a startup. And what they had learned was a little bit better. There were projects they've been working on for a number of years, and through the program, they had learned a little bit better about how to hit the right notes to make it attractive to a partner. And we were totally happy to facilitate that, right? Because I don't have a horse in the race either way. I want to see more great technologies get developed and you will be successful so you can do it again. Or if it's not going to be, successful, for you to figure that out so you can go invent the other things that you're going to invent. So those are all successes from where I'm sitting.
So I thought about that same question. We recently started a startup, and someone who's very experienced in the field that I'm working with, he talked about the two different options. And in his mind, if you have the opportunity for a license, if you have some pharmaceutical or whatever who's interested in developing a technology, that might be very attractive, and you could get a load of money, that just goes to you. But company probably has a lot of other assets they're trying to develop. And yours might be one of, 300, whatever, that they're developing. So they probably will not give it as much attention, as you would if you were able to start a startup. Where that would be your baby, you're gonna push that forward, and that's your only asset that you're trying to move forward. But I think it's, from what I've learned, it seems like it's very high risk for a startup. Maybe more guaranteed upfront, if you're able to license it out, but in the long run, it may not be as, profitable to do it. That's what I.
Thank you, Rosa. And just to, sorry, Joe, actually, why don't you jump in?
Oh, and it's kind of a follow-up too, kind of a little bit on George's, that, so many technologies are so early stage, nobody's interested in it. So maybe a startup becomes appropriate, but then is it too early for a startup? And my question is, what are some strategies, if you want to put it in a startup, what are some strategies to kind of, in a way, mitigate the early stageness of it? Because I mean, in an ideal world, we've got something that's like ready to go into the pre-IND study program and off you go.
Yeah, so I think that's a great comment, and they're both sort of the same sides of the coin, which is fundamentally the way I think about it is, what are you doing in a startup that you can't do otherwise, right? So a startup is fundamentally a vehicle that allows you to hold an asset, get money to develop that asset, and get it to some point, right? It's not the most efficient way necessarily, and to Larry's point, so Larry and I have had really good natured discussions, I think, because he's, as you saw, I bring him in on purpose because he's very suspicious of the startup process, right? He's like, I'm not sure it's the most efficient way to do this, and he's right some of the time, right? So the way I think about it, and to Rosa's point, we had a project last year that was actually a very mature technological project that I was working with the investigator really closely on. And, but it still has some finicky technical challenges because it's in cell therapy space, it's very new. And his concern was, if I just license this to, Novartis, and it doesn't fit perfectly into their standard processes right now, the efficacy is good, but it's not, I think I can make it a little bit better, and nobody's gonna be there to handle those technical challenges and care the way I'll care to get it through. And so that became a really compelling reason for doing it. It wasn't quite ready to just hand off and send and it'll be good. They can drop it into their very robust pipelines. To your point on the other side of how do you get things, the question you should be asking on the other side is, could I be doing this with a grant? Is it still fundamentally a scientific question? Am I still trying to figure out, does this work? Could you, whether or not you do publish a paper off of it, because sometimes you might choose, if you do choose to do a startup, you might choose not to publish the paper right away, although that has obvious academic implications. But you're saying, like, am I still fundamentally doing things I could be doing with grants, right? Or is it something that's not really a scientific question, but there's work that needs to be done? So I think a good example of that is, you're working with Stan McCarty or Zhishang Nan, so you're developing an antibody or small molecule, you're fundamentally still like investigating, is knocking out or inhibiting this receptor worth it the way I think it's going to be worth it? You did your, siRNA knockdowns or whatever, and you think it's interesting and you want to make a tool, compound, or drug. And you can do that all under grants, right? and it could be, small molecule development's a multi-year process sometimes. So like, I think that's really good. That's probably too early. But then you do that and you're optimizing it. And now you're doing things that aren't scientific. Now you're just trying to make sure you really have a lead, or you have a handful of leads and you're just trying to develop them. So at that point where maybe you've done some of the in vitro safety assays that you can do that are relatively cheap, but you're trying to really start thinking about API, manufacturing, larger toxicity studies, dose ranging, optimization, things that aren't scientific, but are very essential. Get as much of that done as you can while you have the luxury of time and funds, and then once you hit that point, you say, okay, maybe it's not worth, now we're in a place. Because now you have things that you can show people that make it worth investing in too, right? So that's kind of the thing, right? Does that make sense? Is that helpful? There's not an easy answer to all this. You know, like many things in life, it's what are the options in front of you, and what you're trying to figure out in this process is. I actually call this this whole thing we're doing this year is when we talk about like this, you know, what we're kind of doing is one of the questions we're answering is should this be a startup, right? Or is there other options? And I think those other options can be equally good. Any other questions that are like really pressing on people's minds? So that's some notes of things that. Does everybody, because I think this has come up in SaaS a lot this week, which is really one of the points of SaaS. Does everybody understand now maybe a little bit better, or maybe people have stories to share about what I was talking about when I was trying to define milestones, key inflection points versus the goals, the overall goals of what you have to get done? Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have anything surprising that came up in SaaS where they're like, my next 3 steps are X, Y, and Z, and the people in SaaS said, actually, I think the question that's on my mind is, you know, W over here, and that would want to like share something like that? Because I think it could be really illustrative. I'm not going to call anybody out, so I'm gonna see if anybody wants to share, otherwise we can move on. Okay, so we're not gonna, we can move on from that, but just really think about, you know, when you're listening to that feedback, part of the reason I emphasize that point is, you know, this is the question I think everybody's asking over and over. How do I get money to do this? Like, right? That's part of why you're thinking, because I think this is part of why you would do a startup, right? I don't think I can do this on an ROM anymore, or an extra from seed credit, or any of these other mechanisms. And I've kind of hit the limits of what I can justify in an academic setting, and I need to do some actual development. And so you're trying to ask how you find funds. And then when I talk about milestones versus goals, it's, you know what you have to do to get in the clinic from the FDA. People get really focused on the FDA, but what we're really talking about is like, what's the essential question? And so I'll call myself out, I guess, right on this. So when we were doing like the fusion protein, right, one of the essential questions that we uncovered, right, is fusion proteins aren't antibodies. And so we knew it was very makeable. It was very easy to express, right? you just gene edit it, you throw it in some, you know, 293 cells and expresses, and it's pretty easy to purify, right? And then off you go, and you have plenty of material to do your experiments. But 293 cells aren't what's used in industrial manufacturing by and large, right? And most of the manufacturers who do proteins are optimized around antibodies. And so one of the questions we kept getting, because it seemed like such a stupid question from a scientific basis, but it's like, well, are you sure you can make this at scale? Are you using GMP grade materials? And I'm like, yeah, it's super easy, like chemically, scientifically, incredibly easy to make. Like, but yeah, but are you sure? And we're like, yeah, we're sure. Like, well, we don't have the data yet to show it, so we had to go get the data, right? Like, it's just, and it's so frustrating because it's like, obviously this will work, and why are you bugging me with these questions? But if you keep getting the same question, you should just go do it, right? Like, it's not worth the argument, and it's not that expensive for the most part. It's not that difficult. So, that's kind of what we're focusing around. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to uncover all the questions and get those different perspectives in to get you to check all the boxes, okay? Andrew said it perfectly yesterday. Don't give people a reason to say no. So much easier to say no. I don't have to risk anything to say no. I can feel very smart. If I'm an investor, be like, it's not good enough, right? But investors have to make deals. So the one thing that you have to remember when you're talking to investors is if you have a really good project, they gotta invest in something. They're under a lot of pressure. They got that fund limit coming up. They only have a couple years to do it, right? And the really good projects, they're competing with a lot of other people right now to get it. So what you're trying to do is figure out how to tell your story in a way that checks all the boxes. Your technology is a huge piece of that, right? Understanding it, understanding how it's differentiated from everything else. And something I've seen, and I think it's very common because, you know, you go out and you look at normal startup stuff, and this is where I think biotech's a little different, is people get very focused on the market size. Drug prices tend to scale, right? right? If it's truly something that people have to have, I mean, that's not great. I don't actually love that feature, but it's true, right? So maybe don't focus as much on the market size over like, I mean, if you're doing something that's like 200 patients, maybe focus on the market size because that's a problem. But if you're if you're doing something that's sort of like your standard cancer market, what you're really competing against is everything else that's in development that they could be doing, and there's so much other work out there right now, and so market segmentation actually is really what you're trying to address. And even if you and really trying to get outstanding results in that phase 1 trial. And a phase 1 trial is a safety study, but you really want to see signal on your safety study, because I've seen so many stocks will just tank if that phase 1 trial isn't good enough compared to other stuff, right? So, and you won't get your next round of funding. So it can be good enough and not, or it can be good and not good enough. And so that's really the issue. And then the competition becomes an issue of, if there's people who are tremendously well funded and ahead of you, and they're in the clinic, like you really gotta tell people why it's worth spending another $20 million. Secondary products can be just fine. If it's as good as, right, it can be fine. Merck's gotta have one, and then BMS has to have one, and then Pfizer has to have one, right? So if it's something that really starts shifting the market, everybody's gotta get one. So it can be fine up to a point, but it's just something you wanna keep an eye on. So you're helping them justify this to their investment committee. Even if the partner you're talking to loves your project, they have to go back and they have to convince their other partners that this is a worthwhile endeavor. None of them get, most firms, none of them get to make the decision entirely on their own. So try and think about, like, this is, it's a pretty simple checklist, but this is basically the rubric that all firms, when they make a deal, they'll make what's called a deal memo. And it basically has all those categories, and they have to be able to fill them in, right? So if you give people the information they need to fill that in, it's really, really helpful. And then don't be a jerk, and make sure that they like you as a human being, and start talking to people before you actually need to ask them for something, and all of those good things. So that's part of the point of like just reaching out. And then, so the team, the other question I've heard a lot in the last few days is, how do I find a CEO? And it's I don't know if it's a great metaphor or not, but it's a little bit like dating, right? It's like, how do you go find somebody to, you know, spend the next 5 to 10 years working on something that's really hard with you? And somebody responded to me, they said, well, I just want an arranged marriage. And I'm like, well, that's okay. I was like, that's fair. It does seem easier, right? Especially when you're like, you know, I remember when I was younger, I was like, yeah, this whole arranged marriage thing sounds kind of interesting sometimes.
Don't even put any work into it.
You don't put any work into it. But the other thing is, you know, it's that control thing too, and this is a very personal thing of how much control do you want? You know, and if you don't want that much control, there's nothing wrong with that, right? You can work with, as long as you pick good partners, they can be very successful. Some venture firms, you know, there are venture firms, like I said, that do these development deals, and they basically want to take it, they want your input, but they're going to hire their people, and you hope that they're good, and you hope that they're going to do a good job. Probably they will, but you don't know that. You may or may not be part of that process. So I think there's pros and cons of that. But for the purpose, you know, that's hard to predict, right? Like you go talk to those firms, right, and you do that. But even still, you have to be able to, right now you're trying to check all those boxes for them, right? And so I would really think about this is, how do you find the right team, not the right CEO? You may or may not need a CEO. So what I wanted to do for the rest of this before we get into our panel discussion, because I think it'll set some groundwork, we'll use some examples of this from recent history, of different kinds of models that I've seen that work. And then you can ask the people up here the models that they've seen that work, and they all have different opinions and strategies and stories. But the way I would think about it is you're not really trying to find a CEO. You're not really trying to find people necessarily just to work for you. You're trying to find people to work with you. It's a pretty critical distinction. And maybe it's a co-founder. I personally, well, partly because I'm not inventing anything right now, right? I personally wouldn't want to do anything just by myself. I need like that sanity check. I need somebody to be working on something with me, and I find that very motivating. But some people don't, and it works out really well for them. But But you can do a lot of this with advisors, you can do it with specialists, you can do it with clinicians, and so you're sitting in the middle of all this, and you're trying to figure out how do you start bringing these things together. And so you reach out to your scientific, you reach out to your colleagues, like you know a lot of other experts in your space who you are friendly with, maybe you're working with them, and you say, hey, I think this, am I drinking my own Kool-Aid, right? And you start to talk to them, you work with the people here in the program, and you come to us and you say, hey, I have a question. I'm trying to figure out, just because I'm a breast cancer researcher, is breast cancer the right place to do this? And I don't have as many colleagues in prostate cancer, which maybe it applies to, right? And so I need a clinician to go talk to, or I need to understand clinical workflows if it's something that's likely to be implemented more recently. That's where we're gonna go, like, help you find. The more specific those questions are, the easier they are to address. Right? Because it's way easier, or even if we don't have an immediate answer, it's way easier for us to kick it to somebody else, and ask them, and work out through our network. Right? And you're talking to people and you're looking for people excited. Your co-founder doesn't have to be the billion-dollar CEO. So we talked about this on Tuesdays, the founding CEO versus your sort of Series A, B, C, CEO. So we just, there's tons of times you'll see Ben Horowitz Ben from down the hall, he just joined Intelligent Implants. They've been around for 2-3 years here, right? They've been growing really, really well. And they got Ben on as their CEO now because they're ready to go to the next level. But there was a lot of stuff that they were addressing the last 2 or 3 years that they didn't need a full-time CEO. What they needed was to start building that team, right? And so what you'll see as you start to do this is you're working with people, you're talking to smart consultants, getting referrals. Sometimes what a good co-founder or CEO brings you is just referrals to consultants who actually know what they're doing. So I've seen people get led really wrong for a while, working with the wrong people. So like that's part of what we're trying to shortcut for you, is just putting you in contact with people who actually know what they're doing. and a couple hours of a good consultant's time can be, an hour, they charge anywhere from $200 to $400 an hour, a lot of them. So that's expensive when I like to joke, is it like personally expensive or is it biotech expensive? Because that's really expensive on a personal checkbook amount, and it's really cheap when you're talking about the scale of biotech and you're trying to ask people for millions of dollars, and spending a few $1,000s now is like the easiest decision in the world. So that's what we're trying to put you together, and what we're trying to get you to do is start checking all those boxes. And now when you go present, you kind of have that team, you have people you can point to, and you're like, oh, it's not just that I think this is the right clinical plan. This person over here who used to work at Pfizer thinks this is the right toxicology plan and the right clinical plan. And you can appeal to authority, it makes those conversations go way easier. The big thing I want to point out, and I'm going to highlight this as we go through some of these examples, is you have way more capital in this aspect than you think. All of you are at a stage in your career where I promise, some of what we're doing sometimes is stuff, and I had this happen to me yesterday. I was like, hey, I'm having this issue with dealing with this person. I'm like, why don't you just talk to so-and-so? They've been working with them for 20 years, and you have them coming here, in a couple of days. I was like, why don't I talk to so-and-so? That's a great idea, right? So I'm hiding names to protect the innocent, but that was a real example from this week. So you have way more capital than you think, and some of what you need is just somebody reflecting it back at you. So we're gonna get more stories. And part of the reason we're focusing on the stories today is between all the stories is you start to see the patterns, and you start to identify the threads that you can pull in for yourself to make progress. And so I wanted to hit on a couple of people from last year, very different models of how do you start to get a company going, that are all doing well. Someone had asked for negative examples. The problem is negative examples are really hard, especially from the outside, to deconstruct. They're usually complex, and there's a lot of ways things can go wrong. But there's also a lot of ways things can go right. So Sally and Raymond were part of our cohort last year. Both of them are a story that you are probably familiar with. Both of them have invented, kind of as a duo over the last 20 years, multiple technologies that have been licensed out, are in the clinic. I think argenx is about to get one of Sally's technologies approved, right? One of her antibody engineering technologies is about to be clinically approved. And they had some new technology that they came to us with, actually a couple technologies that they came to us with. And through the program, and they said, look, that's been great. We know how to do that model, but we think that what we're working on right now is more of a platform, and we don't want to license off a single asset and lose all the potential and the rest of it. So that's the reason for starting a startup, right? We think that a single asset we're gonna get here, but the platform's potential is here, and if we start carving it off, we're gonna undermine the ability to maximize the potential of this technology. And we're academics. We don't know how to do the rest of this. We always handed it off, and we had great partners. But we think we want to push this out ourselves. We've already gotten a license, which was great. So they were a little bit ahead on that aspect. But now we're trying to still figure out what to do with it. Okay, we can work with that. So one of the conversations we were having over and over and over again is, how do I find the CEO? Right? It was the same question. It was the same answer. Same question. And I was like, do you need a CEO? You guys are doing really well. And they still don't have a CEO. They still don't have a CEO, and they're still in their academic positions, and they split their time between, now they've gone back to Southampton, but they split their time between here and Southampton. They have a lab next door, so they wrote an SBIR. We helped them find a project manager, and now they've hired a couple people, and they're in the lab next door at JLabs. They found, partly through us and partly not, right? A sort of a virtual team of consultants to help them figure out the regulatory aspects, help them figure out the toxicology plan. Somebody that was more of an overall project manager, so there's like the lab manager here, and then there's like sort of somebody who's seen sort of that whole process. Has sort of hired them in. All of them, I think, are part-time. I don't think, other than the people working in the lab, I don't think there's anybody full-time in this lab. Last I checked in with them, we're having some really nice conversations with both venture and a potential pharma partner. And we're trying to decide what was the right option. And the deals, because they're still relatively early, the deals, and because they're perceived as just academics, the deals that we're getting from venture, they're like, I don't know if these are good deals. I was like, well, you're doing pretty well. Do you need the money, or could you do some of these other partnerships? And so that was the decision point last I checked in with them, but they're definitely picking up traction. That's what you're kind of looking for, is you're looking for people who are wanting to engage, and when you're talking to those potential advisors and stuff, have that conversation. Be like, look, I'm trying to figure this out. Some people will, give you a few hours of their time for free, and then you throw them a little bit of equity. You're like, hey, is it okay? Like, what's a reasonable amount here? What can I talk to you about? What can we work with? And when do you want that to change? And you just have a really nice, straightforward conversation with them, and people are pretty open to that. Anybody who's in the startup realm, equity doesn't pay the bills, but they're usually open to sort of flexible conversations, at least in the early stages when you're trying to figure out where you're going. So, anybody have any thoughts on this so far? Okay. So this is a model that they still haven't, like I said, they have hired people, but they still don't have a CEO, and they're growing quite well. And they do have a little bit of flexibility in that their institution allows them to do some of this stuff, as far as like holding positions in the company. But Andy at UT Southwestern is not allowed to be on the board of the company, right? So Andy came to us last year, I think with a great attitude of, I have a technology. It's a microbiota component to support cancer immunotherapies. He's like, I have a great technology, or I think I have an interesting technology. I'm seeing some interesting data. I've been working on it for a while, and I'm trying to figure out, should it be a company? Should I just work with some of the partners that I have, potential pharma partners I have a relationship with? What do I do? And we're like, well, we're gonna figure that out. So I know it's the vague answer nobody likes, but it worked out. So immediately in a SAS session, put him in with like regulatory people, because I wasn't sure about this complex biologic strategy. We put him in with Dan, who has sort of that investment perspective, because I wasn't sure investor would be interested in a complex biologic strategy, right? I thought it was interesting. I thought the data supported the exploration, but there was a lot of question marks, right? Just how these always are. And he continued to work on it. He would get feedback. Be like, hey, people are getting. And the feedback might just be fundamentally. Sometimes the feedback is because people didn't understand your story, but that's still valuable because it tells you how to adjust your story of where people are getting confused. So every time we talked to him, every time he presented to somebody, his deck was a little bit different, which was just great because that's always a sign that somebody's actively working on something, thinking about it. Generated some data. Ended up finding through developing a relationship with Dan and discovered that, hey, we think this is really interesting. Maybe we'll do this together and that'll help solve this problem of nominal aborcy. And ultimately, what they started doing, but they didn't just instantly jump in and say, yep, it's a company now. What they did is like, hey, we're gonna start going through the IP. What else, how could somebody get around this, right? Kind of looking at it from that eye. Doing some additional experiments, right? Doing some additional filings, all in full communication with UT Southwestern, right? Having them be part of that conversation. Thinking about it a little bit more, doing a little bit more, right? Because that's what you're kind of doing. It's like this dance when you're trying to think about putting together a company. You're like, are we gonna do this? Is this good? And at some point you're like, I think now I'm feeling comfortable because I feel like we really had a full conversation. And they ended up forming a company. Found a younger person who's actually sitting as like the president of the company to help keep everything running, but they're working on it together and continuing to run it mostly virtually as again they go through these early stages. But now they have people that are, you have people you're engaging with, you're checking in with, you're making progress. With the social accountability to keep getting things done, and it's moving really well. They filed an SBIR, got the SBIR, so that'll help fund things really nicely early stages. I think they may or may not be taking on a little extra capital, but yeah. So they're moving forward really well. So fundamentally, this is your inventor scientist is still pretty much the lead, but managed to find a partner who is interested in the space, had an interest in the space going in, kind of worked on it with him, and then ultimately helped sort of build like a proto company that they're going to continue to develop, right? So that's up to me. I think that's what people default to, but I wanted to put Sally and Raymond first because I think that's always a viable option is, why aren't you just doing this yourself? Because you have to be super enthusiastic about pushing something forward to get other people enthusiastic about pushing something forward. And even with Andy here, that was his energy. He's like, I'm going to continue to put the time into it. I know I can't do this for forever, but I'm going to continue to put the time into it until I find the right path for it. Then we have TezCat. So TezCat's actually a wholly different model that I think you all can engage with really productively sometimes for these early stages. So TezCat, these guys are actually the graduate student and postdoc that work on this technology, right? So the people in the company, for the most part, are the people who helped work on it at the bench. Maybe they're not the PI. And so again, always have that conversation when you're working on something that can be commercialized. That's their baby too, and maybe they want to, help push it out, right? Maybe they don't. You can't make anybody do anything, but it's always worth having that conversation, right? So these are the guys that helped invent this technology and they call it the beer summit. Sometimes I think they should put that in their pitch, but that's a different issue. They call it the beer summit where they kind of came up, with the idea, and then they took it to their PI and they're like, this is crazy, it'll never work. They're like, yes, it will. And I'm sure we've all had that argument, right? I've been on the other side. I've been on their side of the argument anyway. Helped put it together and got it to a point where they could start thinking about spinning it out. Formed a company and wrote SBIRs to help get some early work done. Got those in. So they came to us actually with a little bit of money. And then wrote some more SBIRs, got it in. They're actually really good at writing SBIRs. They probably could have been academic PIs. And I've been just sort of plugging this along. They still have their original PI, as an advisor, they're collaborating with that person, a lot of the work's still getting done in that lab, right? So they're still in that tight communication, and then in the meantime, because they're younger, they know they have to sort of continue to, build credibility, have managed to bring in a whole suite of advisors and consultants, some, again, many of which they were working on through us, help them refine their plan, because their plan was a little bit more diffuse. There was abundance of enthusiasm, maybe a little bit less focus on like what are you actually executing on, right? Which is, I think, common for these early stages. Really grown throughout the program, and realized actually even at their stage, they were like, oh, we need it. Who should we start thinking about for like additional scientific advisors? I was like, one of their areas is pancreatic cancer, right? And I said, have you talked to Anirban over at MD Anderson, right? Like we know him, he's pretty enthusiastic, he's been involved in a few other companies. He's like, oh, he's one of our collaborators. I was like, well, you don't even need me then. Like, why aren't you doing this? Like, you should just be reaching out, and was able, and now I think has formalized an advisor relationship. Did that with a few other people actually as well. And so now they have a pretty good plan to execute forward. They're still getting a few key experiments done, but it's in a really exciting space because it's a technology that can target RAS tumors without having to target RAS directly, so they can hopefully work around some of the mutation issues that are already emerging against, say, Amgen's drug, although Amgen's drug is making several $billions a year right now. So if they can prove it out, I think they'll be in a pretty productive place to move forward. And so that was the other thing too, is clarifying their stories, so they were talking about what they are and what they are not, right? And so the process that they're taking advantage of is fundamentally a physiological process, but it's exploitable through these RAS mutations and such, and really helping juxtapose themselves against the potential of what Amgen has done, and how much work there still is in that space. And of course, there's been 30 startups that have started, companies that have been started to also address RAS mutations, and clarify how those are all bucketed out, essentially, for the strategies they seem to be taking, and why the strategy is fundamentally different and potentially better. So they've grown tremendously well. It's the right kind of person that can do that. I mean, when you're the younger person, it's a huge career risk as well. So, but also a tremendous opportunity to grow and drive forward. So I think those are a few different examples. All of them have some traits in common. They didn't fundamentally start with a really vague question on how do I solve this really big problem. They refined that question into I don't need to solve the whole problem right now, I need to solve this specific problem, right? So and then we're able to use that to ask for advice. So you're not trying to solve the mysteries of life or starting a company, because that is the multi-million-dollar question. It's you're trying to just get to the next step to figure out if you should be continuing. They listen to the feedback, so when people tell you stuff, you don't have to agree. I'm not gonna tell you should agree, you're the expert, right? But you should listen to understand why they're asking that question, right? So they're probably asking it for a reason, and that's gonna really be the key to being able to address whatever the actual issue is. Many times it's not what's actually being directly highlighted, it's something adjacent to that. And so that's sort of the skill of these conversations. Then you just persist. Honestly, I think the persistence is 90% of it, which is part of why I think PhDs are incredibly good actually at being startup founders. Because you're used to sort of having a bunch of people say, I don't know if this is gonna work, and you're like, I think this is gonna work, and then you sort of have to put together a plan, and you continue to refine that plan after people knock you down, and then so you're used to this cycle, you're used to this grind. It's just a slightly different getting forward that grind. But I think that's it. We're gonna have, I want to have a little bit more discussion, and then we're gonna break, and then we'll have a panel discussion. So thoughts?
And you said one of the, I think, early stage young CEO mostly did the meetings remotely via Zoom. So is that something to consider? Is that doable?
So wait, sorry, which one are you talking about?
I think one of the case studies that at least we recruited some young person to run the company initially.
Andy Cole.
Oh, Andy Co. No, that one, they've met. So actually, that was a relationship that was fostered mostly via Zoom because it was through the cohort last year, and everything we did last year was virtual except for the very last event. So is that a relationship? Is that a thing? Yes. Can you work remotely? Sure. I mean, as long as you don't have to do a lot of work, you can work remotely. Lots of people don't work well remotely, so it's like, do you feel like you can build that relationship remotely? I like to at least meet people once or twice, but that's my preference. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Even to get the SBIR, other kind of grants, takes years, 2 to 3 years. How to sustain those 3 years financially for the company?
How do you sustain the 3 year? Mostly. So for an SBIR, this is the challenge with SBIRs. You can do a lot of work with grants. You're not going to do the work the fastest with grants. So how you sustain it by putting it on ice a lot of times. You're kind of like, well, the same way you do all your other projects, right? We're going to push it forward when we have the funds. Now, your risk is very minimal because you're not investing money until you get the SBIR to do the work, right? But that's the trade-off with grants versus not grants versus venture. Venture helps you move a lot faster. But sometimes you can't.
To get the CEOs, everybody, so they expect something to say, right? Without this one, why they will work for 3 years free? So we need to.
Oh, well, they're not, they're working for equity. So that's the whole, like, why do founding CEOs get such a big cut? Because they're working on this, even just submitting an SBR, even if you're working with a grant writer, so it's only a few $1,000s. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. A good founding CEO is actually pretty critical because they may not have the capability of driving through those later stages, but they're going to get your project in a place to be attractive to those later stages, which is a kind of a different skill set. Yeah, you're working. I mean, they're doing it the same reason you're doing it for free. Is you're not doing it for free. You're doing it on, if this works out, then they'll be compensated. And if it doesn't, then that's how it is. That's the trade-off. Enrique.
Yes. No, Sarah, thank you. I think it's worthwhile to dedicate a little bit more time at how the success looks like for participants, right? I have to say that it's a long run. It's not easy. You're gonna be demotivated, or you're gonna just say, I can't do this anymore. So the couple of things that I learned through the cohort of last year is that participants stayed hungry, right? They stayed hungry to learn more about how to get the startup going, right? They and what I mean by them staying hungry is they attended all the sessions in the program. They asked a lot of questions. They pulled Sarah in and myself and all the resources that we made available to them, like very frequently. I would say that they asked for advice, listened to feedback, and I would say that successful founders took action, right? It might not be exactly the same as the feedback they received or the advice they got, but they always took action and they always had a follow-up to make. So these people stayed engaged, hungry, and the other aspect that I identified was that they somehow found ways to interact with other people in the cohort as well, right? So as much as they stay engaged and they stay hungry, the more successful they came out of the program. And it's easier to say it than to do it. But in the end, I guess it was up to them. It was up to them to make the most out of the program, out of the learnings, the connections, the time, right, in favor of their startup. So the message is, hey, you can do with this whatever you want. It's gonna be on your court to make it a success or not, and to benefit from all the, tools and information and learnings that you're gonna get here, right? So stay hungry, stay motivated, stay engaged, right? And you will have fantastic resources available. But if you don't use them, if you don't leverage them, if you don't ask the right questions, and you don't bring your team members to be part of that process, then you're not gonna be successful, I think. So let's keep it up.
So I guess my question is that from the perspective of an investor, how do they weigh the importance of the management team, like CEO, CFO, and the size? Let's say that, okay, I have a technology, it's fantastic, it will be successful, it's a jewelry in the sand. But at the beginning, as you said, we don't have money to hire a professional CEO or CFO. So let's say my student, I want to be my student is the CEO, and he's very motivated, put a lot of time on it. So, but from the perspective of investor, is this possible? Is this a good thing or bad thing?
I have a lot. They weigh the management team quite heavily. The more that money you're asking for, right? Because I might be willing to give you a few $100,000 as a no if it's the right person. Just to address some questions and then, keep things moving while we're continuing to think about it. The way you can address it is, highlight in the way that you assign titles, how you know, that you're gonna be continuing to build. So in your development plan, it's not just the scientific milestones, it's talking about the team that you wanna build, the people that you wanna bring in. The more people you have identified, or at least are working with, the better, right? So it doesn't have to be a full management team, it can be these consultants, it can be people that you at least are working with that are credible. So what you're essentially trying to do is build that credibility, right? If it's your student, so the student's probably, so CEO is funny, because one could argue that the role of a CEO of a growing company, that pretty much their main role is to set the right milestones and go find money to do it, right? One could argue that is the entire role, and because they're not doing a lot of the actual work day to day, right? So your students probably not doing that. Craig's an exception, although they have hit issues, right? So part of the reason they're doing SBRs is people like, you're not ready yet. So what they're trying to do is build up their data package to make it, again, an obvious choice, right? Would it be easier if he was like 10 years older and had gray hair and had to be like, oh, I worked at Amgen or something? Yeah, probably be easier, right? So.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I say student, just
Yeah.
analogy, right? Maybe just just graduated
So-
or postdoc, just to do the 3 year training, but ready to get to work.
Yeah, the postdoc model tends to work really well.
Are you in as acting operation officer?
Yeah.
Something like that. Don't use the
Yeah, you make a founder or an acting blah, blah, blah. And so again, you're signaling that you know that this is gonna change, but you're still at a stage where you're doing a lot of, technical work. You don't need a full-time CEO, right? And you're continuing to look, you're continuing to build, right? And you have that conversation with them as well, so everybody's aligned. Right. All right, I think we're ready for a break, and then we're gonna come back, we're gonna have a lot more discussions, so I don't want everybody getting discussed out. All right, so come back